Advancing the cause of liberty takes more than just coming up with ideas. It means making them happen. This is Society and the State. Life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Welcome, everybody, to episode 156. And I want to talk, Brian and I, about science. And we have a guest on today who's from a fantastic organization doing important work, the Center for Open Science. We're talking with Tim Errington, who's their Director of Research. Tim, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me. Wanted
to talk with you, Tim, about this issue because I remember watching, I don't know, Brian, you probably saw it too, like a year or two ago, John Oliver did this episode, this 20-minute kind of tirade, if you will, about studies, scientific studies. And he was poking fun at how often newspapers and magazines and online outlets, Brian, you've seen this too, will make these outlandish claims, right? Like eat a chocolate bar a day to avoid cancer and, you know, all these kind of things. You've seen this, right?
It's the perfect appeal to authority. Who's going to argue against science, right?
Right. You can't deny it. And yet we see time and again that some of these issues percolate to the point where maybe that's not actually true. John Oliver points at some of the problems involved in that. So wanted to talk, Tim, with you about this issue, about what does science actually show. So maybe kind of let's start from a broad vantage point. When you see these media claims about, you know, studies suggest X or science shows that Y, what kind of reaction do you have, or what kind of reaction, maybe better put, should our listeners have when they see these claims made about what science does or does not say?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the way I always view it, I think the way anyone should view it is you should have skepticism, and it should be a healthy skepticism. This is true regardless of whether it's science or not. I'll get a little bit into, I think, a important part of science is don't just trust the source that told you that. Make sure that you can go back and actually look at it yourself. And the reason I say that is because the reason you can make, you know, really exciting headlines is because we all want to believe that. It's very easy just to want to believe that. And sometimes it's not to say that what one hears in a headline is flat out false, right? You shouldn't dismiss it either. Mm-hmm. You should have that healthy skepticism of, oh, interesting. Is this building on work? Is this the first time I've ever heard this, or is this adding to the foundation of a growing knowledge base? And the reason that's really important is science kind of should, and when it works really well, it operates in an open, transparent manner, right? You can see the evidence. You don't have to trust the source. You don't have to trust who's saying it or where it's being published.
Right.
You can look at the data yourself. And I think that's really important because if you can't do that, then it's not operating the right way.
And so
when I see these reports, it's a question of whether it's a singular study or if it's building on multiple studies.
And also maybe the model of the study itself, right? How many people are involved and what process they used, because not all study is structured the same way. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. And I think that's a really important point. One, like anything else, if I only do it a couple times or I have a very small number of people I'm looking at or sample size, it's prone to probably have some bias in there. Whether we acknowledge it or not, it probably exists because we know that what we're really trying to do in science is understand the entire world around us, but we can't study everything. So then the question that we always debate as scientists is, well, what's a good sample size? How many people should I use, or how many times should I look at this event? And obviously, we can't spend all of our time looking at everything. And obviously, even if one person does that with one technique, there's probably some bias in there. I think that's the truth of it, right? Science itself is a great tool, but it's humans that are doing it, and we're prone to biases that we, can't always see in ourselves. And that's kind of a big challenge that we have in science, which is why it's important to be transparent on what's the sample size, what techniques were you using, what data did you find, what methods did you use?
Tim,
and let's do it again.
And that's exactly the point I want to bring up, Tim. It seems to me that if studies show X, and if X is in fact true, that it should be able to be replicated. I think of, Brian, do you remember this one? It's not coming to me right now, but after World War II, there was the study of authority where you would shock an authority figure in a white lab coat would come in.
You thinking of the Milgram experiment?
Yes, thank you. The Stanley Milgram, right? This is the one where an authority figure comes in and tells you need to shock that other person. Oh, they've consented. Don't worry. You hear screams in the other room, and the person continues administering what they think is higher and higher doses of electricity until they don't hear the person anymore. What I found interesting about the Milgram experiment is that it's been replicated in many countries, cultures, years, and they consistently find that the results hold true, that people are willing to, suppress their conscience, if you will, and submit to authority. That's really interesting because it shows validity, because time and again, they have found fairly consistent results. Tim, you just brought up that important point that not only is the model and the sample size and everything important, but can we replicate it? Talk to us about the problem more broadly speaking in kind of the scientific study world, if you will, about replication. Is it done? Yeah. Is it not done? What are the issues there?
Yeah, no. That's a great question. I'm actually going to go back to that example you gave, and there's an important part there, which is it took time, and you can't expect everything to replicate, and I'll get on that point in a second. But it takes time. When something holds true, it's because we keep trying to beat it up. We keep trying to figure out if it's not going to hold true, and sometimes that means we have to redefine what that original claim is. And sometimes we don't. Sometimes it's like, oh, great, this actually did speak to a broader, quote unquote, truth. And I think that's the key part around science, is that we should be sitting there and saying, okay, one study is not enough. We know that. We all as scientists know that. And we, as I think the greater public, need to appreciate that. And it's a difficult thing to appreciate because we want to think that a single, exciting claim tells us some given truth. And really what it does is it tells us our best guess at that time. That scientist's best guess at that time, with all the biases that are a part of it. Mm-hmm. And again, I'm not speaking at all to anything about somebody doing fraudulent behavior. That I have no patience for that. I think what we're talking about here is just the actual mundane aspect of science, how science operates, or how it should operate. And so replication plays a really, really important role in us as scientists essentially trying to confront each other in light of that evidence, right? Trying to sit there and ask ourselves, okay, well, if you found it in your study with the way that you did this, I should be able to pick it up and do it again. It's the thing we're taught in early elementary school about science process, right? You ask ask my own son this, right? He's learning this now in science class about what are the process, and it kind of goes through to the point where you have this replicable event, or you hope that you have it in terms of outcome. And I think the key there is we need to be able to communicate as scientists what we did and what we found and what we have to hope for, if it's indeed right, that if somebody else was to do it again in a different place, different setting, maybe some slight modifications, because you can never do the same thing again, can I get the same result? And I think the problem is that seems, maybe even to your audience, not very exciting, right? Oh, it's not very exciting to do the same thing again. But I think it plays a vital role in research. It's really important that we do that.
Tim, I'd like to get your opinion on whether the nature of scientific research is prone to a very human nature characteristic of self-interest. And what I'm referring to is there are scientists historically who researched for the sake of research. In other words, they sometimes they had to scramble to find the funding or to come up with the ability to do their research, but it was the research that drove their quest to learn what they were learning. So much of the research today is funded by either government grants or other grants that are given. Do you see any tendencies within some areas of the scientific community where the research maybe takes more of an emphasis on keeping that funding flowing than simply research for the sake of research itself?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think what you're at the heart of that question, and even to the last one, I didn't quite get into that, is that as much as science in an idealistic standpoint is for the pursuit of knowledge, like you said, it's for the pursuit of discovery, we have to recognize that the scientists, myself included, the scientific enterprise, I have bills to pay, right? I have a job that I need to hold. And thus that means that whether I know it or not, the pressures to kind of succeed in that system could actually undermine the system a little bit. I think that's kind of what you're getting at. Yep. And I think that's true. And it's hard to pin it down on some specific thing, but there are key elements to it. And it's basically the incentive structure of science. And it's something that we work on at the Center for Open Science to kind of align that with scientific practice, right, for the pursuit of knowledge. So good examples of that are publishing only positive results. Scientific journals are very prone to this. We know this, called publication bias. People have studied it. We see lots and lots of positive results, but we know that not every experiment that a scientist conducts gives a positive result. We know that both because of maybe not the best design choices, like a small sample size, or just because the fact that we don't know everything. That's why we're researching it, that many times we find these negative or null results, but they never get published. Nobody really communicates that. That's a huge problem, because that means that we're only surfacing and incentivizing positive results. And that's important, because as a researcher, I need to publish papers to get grants. But if I can only publish papers if they get an exciting positive result, then I'm probably going to sit there and consciously, if people do fraud, or unconsciously create those results. I'll create exciting findings, even though they're not there. And that's because the system itself is rewarding it. Even though science itself to advance doesn't need to see that, right? It's the question we're asking and how we design it, not the outcome that we get. So you are right that I think at all levels, journals that publish the research that essentially make the currency, those feed into the grants that one applies for, right? You can't really get a grant unless you've shown that you can publish, but I just told you can't publish unless you get positive results. And then hiring, right? Universities, for instance, right? That's where a lot of it in academia, it's a lot of jobs and research are held. They reward and promote and hire people who publish in exciting journals and get grant money. And so the system itself is kind of feeding on, a bit of a misaligned loop. And in that case, you kind of hit on the head, which is it should be rewarding the best questions, right? And the best methodology, regardless of outcome. But instead, we reward outcome, as if somehow the scientist is able to control what they found, which we better not be doing that.
So enter the Center for Open Science. You guys exist, as I understand it, at a high level to kind of address some of these maybe misaligned incentives and be able to try and improve things. So talk to us about your guys' work and how you're trying to address some of the things you brought up, Tim.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's right. That's our broad mission, is to increase reproducibility and integrity and openness of research. And that's agnostic to discipline, because this is not unique to certain sectors. It's unique to all of science. We do this through a handful of activities. So I lead our research team, and one of those is to conduct replications to try to understand what the current landscape is like. And what I mean by that is, can I replicate? Can I get the same result? And if I can, what challenges am I being confronted with? We know there's a publication bias, but what else is happening? Like, even with that publication bias, one hopes that results are reproducible to an extent. We don't know what that is. Nobody's ever really measured it. So we've been starting to do that in different disciplines, started in psychology. We're doing it in my own background in preclinical cancer research. But we also know that that's not a means to the end. That's collecting evidence. What we also want to do is, as I mentioned before, align incentives with practice, or the ideals of science. And so a good example of that is working with funders and working with journals to kind of align those incentives. So the best one that we have is trying to change the publication model, get a different approach there. One, as we call it, registered reports. Here, as a researcher, I submit my idea. I submit my research plan. What's the question? What's the sample size, the protocol? What's everything I'm going to do? How am I going to analyze the data? But before I know the results. And I send that to the journal. And if the journal thinks that's a good idea, and that it's done well, that the design is done well, they agree to publish the results regardless of what the outcome is. So that way, we'll get negative results and we'll get positive results. But we know that one thing is important, which is we're going to get quality results, at least to the best of our knowledge. And to us, we see that as the right way. One, reward the researcher for getting the publication, for doing the work. But two, don't bias them on the outcome, which they do not control. We also develop technology. We know that that's a big piece of this, is how do you communicate? And science, is, as amazing advances as we take, we still, in many places, still kind of operate under like very old aspects, right? Using paper notebooks, not really sharing all information. Yet we live in the digital age. And so we realize that technology itself is probably a great way to kind of help increase the transparency and openness of research.
Talk to me, Tim, about the gravity of what's at stake, right? If you guys don't succeed, if the broader mission isn't accomplished, then what challenges do we face as a people in continually being subjected to these kind of one-off scientific studies that are never actually validated? What's at stake if you guys don't succeed?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a lot that can be at stake. I think probably the biggest one is public trust. I think it's really important that we continue to trust scientific results, but not because of its science per se, or the researcher who did it, or what they found. It's because of the process, because it's open, transparent, and rigorous. And we need to maintain that, or get back to it, I should say. And we should be able to identify it if it's not under those aspects. And that doesn't mean that all data can be open. It means that if data is not open, and there's lots of reasons why it shouldn't be, tell me why. Just tell me why you can't open it, so that way I at least understand why I'm not seeing something. And I think it's really important there, because if we don't have trust, especially in this day and age where there is, one, easily accessibility of information, and two, we can communicate throughout the globe at a rapid clip, that science has got to catch up to this. Science has got to start to communicate faster, both as scientists and more openly to scientists and the public. And I think that's the most important thing that's at stake, because if not, and you start to undermine trust in scientific research, I think you essentially defeat the beauty of science, and you kind of can crumble under its own weight, so to speak.
Tim, you've piqued my curiosity as to why, in some cases, it would be necessary for certain data to not be open. Could you give an example of why that might be?
Yeah. The best example is an ethical reason. So whether that's a health study or whether that's a psychological study, I personally would never want my own personal information disclosed to somebody. My name tied to, say, my genetic profile of a given tissue. And the reason for that is because of the ethical concerns that can sit around that being exploited, both for bad reasons, many things that one can imagine there. So I think that's probably the easiest reason to wrap it around. Anytime you're doing anything with human subjects, that ethical reason is really, really important that we should guard. Same reason why I don't want bank information out there. If I'm giving my information to my bank, I don't want them to make that information public. Another reason, and again, there's pros and cons on that, is IP. So we recognize that science, especially in certain disciplines, butts up to business. You think of pharmaceutical companies as an example, biotech. So, regardless of what one thinks about that, we do understand that those are businesses, and just like any other business, they have certain IP that they should be able to retain to, at least within a certain period of time, to be able to pursue that line of dissemination and research and development. And so as a result of that, they might not at one given point disclose all information. That's fine. It's a bias that one can consider, right? Now I can't see it because of a conflict of interest. But at least if you disclose it, then I, as a consumer of that, can kind of weigh the evidence in light of that disclosure. If you don't tell me, right, if you don't tell me why you're not sharing the data, then I can't do that. I think a big thing is, can we shift the norms to where it's essentially more open by default and closed by exception? I think that kind of helps us. As consumers of research, it helps you kind of digest and weight the evidence appropriately.
Thank you.
Tim, I reached out to you for this interview after encountering an article in Slate, which we'll link to on the show notes page. I should also point out we're going to link to your organization's website, that John Oliver segment, which is very worth watching for those who haven't seen it. Additionally, I'm going to link to another article, which we won't have time to talk about, which is a researcher who fooled millions of people into thinking that chocolate can help with weight loss by doing this kind of semi-fraudulent study, getting it published in a journal no one knows about, just to kind of prove the point that the system can be gamed and that the system needs reform. So all those things will be on today's show notes page, which is societyandthestate.com/156. As I said, the Slate article will be included. Tim, as you know, this is an instance in which there was a study published in the journal Science, a prestigious journal, purporting to show that conservatives and liberals respond differently to threats. Some researchers actually got in touch with the original researchers of that study. They tried to replicate it. They couldn't. And the original researchers were very, conciliatory and cooperative and recognizing some of the failures. However, when these new researchers tried to get the Science journal to replicate or rather publish this replication study and try and basically retract to a degree what had been previously published and asserted, the journal refused. Well, you've kind of talked about this a little bit. Let's talk about it head on as maybe our final question here for the interview. What are some of the limitations in trying to get these replication studies when journals and media outlets are very willing to publish these initial bold claims and they're sexy and so forth? But when your work involves maybe the less sexy work of just trying to validate other people's claims, how do we, I think of like in the media, right? Like some big claim will be made about the shooter, this guy was a shooter and he had this gun. And when it turns out that that's not actually true, they don't publicize the retraction and walk it back to the same degree. And so the public is led to believe that initial claim, and we don't really get the public to really fully understand or be aware of the retraction. How does the journal process, the media process, make it a challenge for these replication studies to see the light of day and help the public have that trust that you point out is so important in the scientific community?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it's obviously a good example that I think hinges on a lot of things that we were talking about and we as the center really focus on. In this example, right, like the replication is not saying that the original was wrong and should be retracted. I think that's actually really good, because usually we see these instances and they're like, oh, look, I found out that this person faked their data. And then, the place like Retraction Watch picks it up. Here, it's information being updated. And actually what it is it's also showing us what we talked about earlier, probably because, again, it's not to say one's right or wrong, but it's saying sometimes the methodology we use can lead us kind of astray. So this science paper, right, the one in 2008, small sample size for that type of study. Small sample size, exciting finding, especially in that climate. The most prestigious journal picks it up, publishes it, and then kind of moves on. Right, this replication that follows up is starting to do better practice, larger sample sizes, a lot larger sample sizes, which is really good. The field needed that. Many fields need that. Costs more money, but you get better results when you do that. They implemented better practices like pre-registration, the idea of I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do before I get my result, just like I was echoing before.
Yeah.
Which, it's still not common practice in many fields, but we know it's important. We really do. That's why clinical trials are registered. There's an important reason to say what you're going to do to try to minimize your bias. So that's what's really exciting, is that this is an instance of somebody taking all of the new tools that are available and trying to say, look, in light of this, these new tools we have, we went back, looked at this other evidence, we just can't get the same result. I'm not saying that the original result's not true in terms of like what they found. I'm saying that it's probably overstated. And if there is an effect, we can't find it. So, I'm not saying that you made up the data. I'm just saying that there's a good chance that that finding was not solid enough and it hasn't held up over time, back to what you were saying before. We want these things to hold up over time, and maybe this one doesn't. And so the question now that we struggle, and this is where you're getting at, and there's no clean answer to this, which is how do we update? So when I think of, again, back to technology, right now, if I was writing a journal article, and we do this now, actually in that site article, they had to correct the image that they posted. Mm-hmm. And there's on the bottom, they tell you, we've updated this in light of the information we found. We don't really do that in scientific journals, right? Only you can correct, but nobody bothers to do it. It's a separate article. It's when we publish these papers, especially now that they're digital, they're not paper anymore, right? They're not physical. I mean, science still does give physical copies, and maybe that's the problem, is we should move more to digital, is we don't update in live real time, right? Mm-hmm. So what one would want is I should be able to go to that science article and be able to learn not just what was found in 2008, but I should be able to learn everything that was found since then. I should be able to tie it back together.
Right.
Now, I think if this replication could have been published in Science, one, they don't have a policy for allowing that. So that's something that we've been working on with journals, is let's have a policy around publishing replications. Even if Science was to publish the replication, it still might not be tied back and forth, right? The reason we're hearing about it is because it got into the news. The replication authors wrote about it. But the problem is it still doesn't really allow us to kind of tie together the scientific literature in a better way, to allow one to understand it and to be able to kind of connect the dots. Right now, the easiest way to do that is either hope for a Slate article to be written or be really good at Google searching, right. which is a good tool to have, but it's not really the best way to kind of update your information over time. So I think this is a great example of, like, one, exactly what is wrong, because that's a journal that you published in. It makes or breaks a career, right? You get in there and, like, you are going to have a really good career as a scientist in terms of the traditional way of rewards. But when one wants to go there and kind of be able to publish a more mundane research, we need those journals to be able to publish it just as well, replications. And again, hopefully the big top journals like Science and Nature will start to shift their policies towards this, because I think when they start to do it, everybody else starts to. But in the meantime, me personally, and I think as hopefully your listeners can pick up on this, which is, I like to see in any given paper, regardless of where it's published, can I go back and understand and see more about how you conducted your work and what you found? And I think that's always going to be true. And I think that's kind of right now what we're seeing in this current age, and I think hopefully we as the Center for Open Science are contributing to that. I know other organizations are as well, which is how do we start to create more tools and more incentives that allow for better research practices. So we can't go back in 2008 and fix what happened in 2008. Doesn't mean that we should dismiss 2008, but it does mean that moving forward, we should have a new expectation of what we expect when we publish scientific results.
Great stuff. Tim Errington is Director of Research for the Center for Open Science. We'll link to that website and all the other material we mentioned on the show notes page, societyandthestate.com/156. Tim, thanks so much for joining us.
You've been listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.